This is America at 250. Due Diligence.
One toke over the line.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
President Richard Nixon in 1971 declaring a national enemy and a new federal offensive against it.
38 years earlier, Americans had celebrated the end of another federal offensive, this one against alcohol.
For nearly 14 years, the Constitution prohibited intoxicating liquor. Then, for the first and only time in American history, the country passed one amendment for the express purpose of repealing another.
Alcohol prohibition required the Constitution twice, once to impose it, once to repeal it. Marijuana prohibition came through federal law.
Washington has now eased federal treatment for qualifying medical marijuana, but adult-use marijuana remains federally prohibited, even as state after state has legalized it under their own laws.
Which raises an old American question in a new form. What happens when Washington declares a national moral rule, but the states, the courts, and much of the public refuses to move together?
Today on America at 250 Due Diligence, how national prohibition was built, how enforcing it changed the Supreme Court, and why marijuana has created a new constitutional standoff.
One toke over the line: prohibition, marijuana, and the limits of federal power.
National prohibition did not begin with speakeasies, bootleggers, or Al Capone. It began with nearly a century of temperance organizing, churches, women's groups, and campaigns that first won restrictions state by state.
By the time the 18th Amendment took effect in 1920, the Anti-Saloon League had turned that moral movement into a disciplined political machine, one that could pressure lawmakers, defeat opponents, and write its goal into the Constitution.
Richard F. Hamm is a distinguished teaching professor of history and Collins Fellow at the State University of New York at Albany, a leading historian of Prohibition and the author of Shaping the 18th Amendment.
Professor Hamm, welcome to America at 250 Due Diligence.
Professor, before we get into a bit of discussion about the law, set the scene for us. By the time the 18th Amendment passed, Americans had been fighting over alcohol, I think, for the better part of a century. Why did this particular push finally win when so many earlier ones had failed?
It's really a good question. I mean, temperance is, it was over a century old. It was the oldest of the American reforms by this point. It had emerged with the new republic, and it had emerged as a response to the tremendous alcohol consumption of American society. In the 1820s, it's estimated by scholars that the per capita adult consumption of pure spirits, so 200 proof spirits, so you add together all the beer, the wine, whiskey, and then divide it up, was about 6 gallons per adult.
We were the Russians back then.
We were beyond the Russians. We are, one scholar calls us the alcoholic republic, and there was a kind of revulsion about this. And the first response was, kind of a rational response. We should moderate it, and hence the word temperance. We should have a temperate use of alcohol. And that, in the 1820s and 30s, gets an infusion of revivalist Christianity from the Second Great Awakening. And alcohol consumption begins to be seen as a sin, not just as something that's unhealthy or not wise, but as a sin. And, you don't deal with sins by saying by degrees. You just don't do sins. That's, it's bad. And the result was they developed a kind of absolutist mentality. And you get a true reform movement in the 40s and 50s, 1840s and 50s, that is based on moral suasion, that really actually drops out alcohol consumption quite a bit because it becomes not legitimate for people to drink in certain circles. Maine is the first state that passes the law. So by the 1850s, they're actually trying prohibition, trying to ban the retail sale of alcohol for consumption. And it sweeps across the nation, not too far into the South, but there is a movement still there. Then the Civil War comes along. It kind of collapses that. And 3 prohibition states limp on into the 1860s and 70s. And it seems like the temperance movement has died. And then it gets a revitalization in the late 1860s. Was a splinter group from the Republican Party, becomes the Prohibition Party, a party dedicated to national prohibition, and is joined in the 1870s by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a group of women who are, again, they believe consumption of alcohol is a sin, and it causes all sorts of problems.
We should point out, women could not vote at that time.
Women could not vote. But their moral presence is really important to the story, because what is happening, even though alcohol consumption is about the same rate it had been for since the 1850s, it's gotten concentrated in a specific institution, the saloon. The solution by the Prohibition Party and the WCTU is to call for a national prohibition amendment. They don't have the political clout to do anything like that. And what they do instead is they make progress in the states. If state prohibition had declined, there's a revitalization of it in the 1880s in places like Kansas and Iowa. And then this peculiar thing happens. It turns out the federal government interferes with state prohibition. That the way the federalism works, the states can't block the importation of liquor from out of state. The way the federal tax on alcohol works, it turns out that the federal government is happy to give federal tax stamps to liquor sellers in dry state. Prohibition doesn't thrive in the 80s and 90s. And in the 1890s, a new organization grows up, the Anti-Saloon League. And the Anti-Saloon League shares the same ideas of the earlier prohibitionists, the Prohibitionist Party members and the Women's Christian Temperance Union members, but they have a different approach to things.
Talk about that approach.
Okay.
And talk about how the Anti-Saloon League, what they were able to figure out, and about moving Washington and the various state houses that maybe earlier movements that you talked about had not had that same success.
The Prohibition Party and the WCTU were very much idealists, and they were also very reform-minded, and they did not just focus on prohibition. They got interested in the money issue. They got interested in antitrust. They got interested in railroad regulation. There was an attempt to join with the people's parties, the populists. They never really were able to affect the political party machinery of the Democrats and Republicans that ran the country in most state houses. They were outsiders. They were purists. We don't want any halfway measures. We only want prohibition. What the Anti-Saloon League does is it comes along and it says, we'll take any measure that will reduce alcohol anyway, put a restriction on it anyway. So while we don't like local option, particularly, and the Prohibition Party was against local option. They only wanted prohibition. Local option allows a community to choose whether it's going to be wet or dry. The Anti-Saloon League said, that's great. It dries up some of the nation. Moreover, they are a single issue organization. They pioneered what we consider modern lobbying.
I got a question about their effectiveness. Well, alcohol was a huge business in the United States. Usually, when you're talking about lobbying and you say that the prohibitionists invented modern lobbying, weren't the makers of alcohol and the bar owners and the distributors out there lobbying against all this?
This is, there is a convergence of forces going on that makes the 18th Amendment easier to pass. Structurally, there was always a division between the manufacturers of hard alcohol, in America mostly whiskey, wine, and beer. The beer manufacturers were probably the most adroit of the lobbyists. They were scattered across the nation. Those centered in the Midwest. The Midwest had the biggest of the national brewers who engaged in interstate commerce, and they had been very effective in fighting prohibition. They were also predominantly German American. And so the coming of World War I hurts them because they are tarred as un-American, and their lobbying is seen as suspect because of their names. And in fact, before America enters the war, their earlier advocacy of the German side in World War I. So also the whiskey manufacturers and the brewers and the wine producers never cooperated in fighting.
Let's kind of move now to enforcement. How uneven was enforcement across the country, and how did kind of different states and different localities handle it? Because everyone handled it differently, didn't they? I would imagine.
They did. The ideal plan of the Anti-Saloon League is that the federal government would set the parameters. And so the Volstead Act sets the quantity of alcohol in liquor in a beverage that makes it intoxicating by law. See the scare quotes in my hand. Intoxicating like law. 0.1, half 1%. Okay, so you have energy drinks today that would fall under that definition. There were people deluded in the right before Prohibition, thinking beer was going to be legal, and they were wrong because the federal government sets the limits like that, and the states have to go along with that. Those are very early court decisions to decide that. The Anti-Saloon League goes out and it pushes the states to enact their own enforcement laws, and almost every state except Maryland enacts a law. Now, whether they go around enforcing it or not really depends on who's in the state, who's in power in the state, and how bad things have gotten when it comes to publicity about too much drinking and crime or corruption. So, New York, for instance, under Anti-Saloon League pressure, gets through an enforcement law. A little Volstead Act, if you want to call it that. That's what they called it at the time. And it is being enforced upstate. In New York City, one scholar says the Prohibition Amendment was enforced for all of about 2 minutes. That the parties, ratification is coming, it's going to go in effect. There's a party going on, and they're drinking. Ratification, it comes into effect, they're still drinking.
Who was getting paid off then?
This is one of the sad truths of a miscalculation by the Anti-Saloon League. By exempting the federal officers from civil service, it just invites men to join that service in the Prohibition Enforcement Bureau who are in there for the bribery. Probably the most famous bootlegger on the West Coast, Mr. Olmsted, he learns his business of being a bootlegger by being a police lieutenant in the Seattle Police Department. And so basically he learns his craft by the people he arrests.
So we're recording in partnership with the University of Mississippi, the Jordan Center for Journalism, Advocacy, and Innovation at the University of Mississippi. And Mississippi was the last state to end statewide prohibition in 1966. What allowed prohibition to survive so much longer in places like Mississippi?
It was allowed to survive because there could always be a trickle of alcohol that could get in, and it was hard to overcome in some places. And Oklahoma and Mississippi are two of the places, but there were other southern states too, where alcohol had been so successfully demonized that the electorate that the religious oriented electorate was very strong, and they basically could no one could organize enough to strike down the system. They were an anomaly by that point.
What's the lesson here about legislating morality or even trying to put it into the Constitution?
When you ask the question legislating morality, you sound actually like the Wets argument that failed. They argued again and again that what prohibition was sumptuary laws, the equivalent of telling people what they could eat and what they could drink. The prohibitionist message was that they were acting in the public good, that this was the individual had to sacrifice for the public good. And that carried the day for the longest time. So, and remember, drinking had been stigmatized as a male activity, not a good activity. And therefore, that would carry the day. So, you can legislate morality, but you have to understand morality is often defined by the society. And one of the ironies of national prohibition is by making it illegal, by transforming the saloon into the speakeasy, which is open to men and women, they begin and is open to the middle class, not just working people, as the saloon tended to be a working man's establishment. You have this re-legitimization of alcohol. That it's okay to drink, and it's okay for women even to drink. And so that's the morality argument then began to be used against prohibition successfully. So it's in some ways it's what the democracy will put up with. Alcohol was far more integrated into American society than marijuana ever has been. And it was a successful business. It was big business, yet it was outlawed.
But didn't making it forbidden also make it enticing?
Yes, making it forbidden made it enticing. But for every, I was co-editor on a book about prohibition's greatest myths, and each of the authors talked about their family's prohibition experience, and I talked about my grandmother's. And my co-author, Michael Lewis, he said, my grandparents and my parents, they were teetotalers. And I came from a teetotaler culture, and our experience was prohibition didn't affect us one whit because this was okay for us. And it's important to remember that national prohibition did actually reduce alcohol consumption to the lowest levels it's ever been in American society, down to about 1.5 pure gallons of alcohol per capita consumed. So, we could still have it if the prohibitionists had been willing to compromise. If when the ideas of modification were surfaced in the mid and late 20s, if they said, yes, let's legitimate 3.2 beer and light alcoholic wine, we'd still have prohibition.
Really? You think so?
Wow.
Yeah, there would be. Yeah, historians are terrible at counterfactuals, but I could think it would last.
Professor Richard Hamm of the University at Albany.
Prohibition grew from decades of state campaigns and a political movement powerful enough to write its cause into the Constitution.
But passing it was easier than enforcing it, especially when state and local officials lacked the resources or the will to cooperate.
That enforcement fight would reshape federal power and the Supreme Court. Robert Post of the Yale Law School is next.
This is America at 250, Due Diligence. Here's Steve Herman and Bill Bernardoni.
By the 1920s, the Supreme Court faced an extraordinary challenge: how to enforce a national constitutional command that much of the country openly defied.
Chief Justice William Howard Taft saw resistance by the wealthy and influential as a direct threat to the rule of law. Other justices were divided over whether judges should rigidly enforce a valid law or whether law had to remain connected to custom and public legitimacy.
Those disputes did more than decide the fate of bootleggers. They produced the automobile exception to the warrant requirement and a foundational fight over electronic surveillance.
And during the same period, Taft helped give the Supreme Court far greater control over which cases it would hear, building much of the institutional court we know today.
Robert C. Post is a Sterling professor of law and former dean of Yale Law School and the author of The Taft Court, Making Law for a Divided Nation, 1921 to 1930.
Professor Post, welcome to America at 250 Due Diligence.
So set the table for us. What happened to the Supreme Court when Prohibition took effect in 1920 and the Constitution itself imposed a nationwide rule that millions of Americans, including some of my ancestors and some of my relatives, were prepared to defy?
Well, to understand its impact on the Supreme Court, you have to understand a little bit about American constitutional jurisprudence. So the court today is apt to say we follow history and tradition. I don't know whether you follow the modern Supreme Court, but like in a case like Dobbs, which struck down the abortion right, the court says we follow history and tradition. And by that, they mean there are the facts of what happened in the past. We learn the facts, and that's the law today. That's what Dobbs mean. We count how many states banned abortion, and if a great number did, then the history and tradition tells us it was banned. The court in 1920 followed history and tradition, but it wasn't that kind of a history and tradition. It was understood to be a living history of the norms and customs and traditions of the American people, and judges were experts in interpreting those customs. So they didn't count regulations. What they thought was who we are is a function of who we were. It's a function of our customs, and it's a normative proposition. It's a proposition about who we are, about our identity. And judges are the experts in understanding the collective identity of Americans by looking at our traditions and our past. It's exactly really the opposite of the modern court. And so judges always were evaluating in a moral way legislation passed by a Congress or by state legislatures and saying, is it consistent with these traditions or not? And if you look at the way law was conceived, say in the year 1900 or even 1920, it's very interesting. The leaders of the bar would say the obligation of lawyers is to follow the law, and the law is the customs and traditions of the American people, and that's in contradistinction to mere legislation. Legislation just happens to be what a bunch of people passed on a given day in the State House. And it's arbitrary. It's just the will of the majority at a given time. But the law is the abiding customs and traditions of the American people. So it's exactly opposite to what we think of now as a distinction between law and custom.
One thing I think we need to explain, which was very unusual, the only time it's happened in American history, a previous president of the United States, William Howard Taft, is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time.
Correct. He's appointed by Harding as Chief Justice after he loses the 1912 election. So in 1920, he becomes Chief Justice. But to go back to the jurisprudence for a second, there was a justice who invents what we now call modern American constitutional jurisprudence, and that's Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Oliver Wendell Holmes looks at America in 1890, and he says, what do you mean customs and traditions? Americans are fighting about everything. They're fighting about labor. They're fighting about, what sort of regulations to impose on the marketplace. There is no unified custom. So the court's inventing a fiction. They're inventing a conservative fiction to stop progressive legislatures. And so what the court's job is to follow legislation over custom and tradition. That's called positivism. And what Holmes said is the job of a court is to follow the will of Congress or the will of a legislature, because that's what law really is. It's the will of the legislature. This was radical when Holmes invented it in 1900, and most of the court, say in 1915, would disagree with Holmes. They would say our job is to do the custom and tradition and to check legislation. And Holmes is saying, no, our job is to follow legislation and not to invent this custom and tradition, which is really our class interest, to overrule the legislation. And the modern court, when they do history and tradition, is following Oliver Wendell Holmes. They're saying the law of history and tradition is a fact, which we have to follow, which is a form of positivism. It's very ironic. The meaning of history and tradition has turned 180 degrees. Okay, so that's the background. And along comes Prohibition. Prohibition is one of the greatest acts of legislative reform in the history of the country. All of a sudden, in a moment, the federal government is responsible for keeping people from drinking all over the country. The federal government has no capacity to do that, no plan to do that, no personnel, no enforcement mechanisms. They had not had demands on the federal government like that since Reconstruction, right after Civil War. I mean, this is an astonishing amplification and expansion of federal responsibility. And what's more, Prohibition went against the customs and tradition of half the country.
How did that resistance to Prohibition sharpen, if it did, sharpen problems for the court?
So the court is faced with this idea of if people's customs and traditions are overridden by popular legislation, they get really pissed. They get really angry. I mean, who are these feds that come in and say, I can't have my communion wine or I can't have my beer after work? The labor unions had originally supported Prohibition. Prohibition left ambiguous what would be banned in the Constitution, but it was promptly supported by something called the Volstead Act. You have to understand that the major interest group in support of Prohibition was something called the Anti-Saloon League. And the Anti-Saloon League was funded by mainly evangelical churches who were mainly from the South. And these people were teetotalers. They wanted no liquor. And America was not prepared to go no liquor. They were prepared to stop hard liquor and stop various things. So there was a broad coalition in favor of Prohibition. It comes out of World War I, and we're saving wheat for the armed forces. We're saving food for the armed forces, and we have to be efficient, and we can't be drinking while our kids are dying over there in France. This sort of thing. So there's Prohibition Amendment is passed more quickly than any other amendment in the history of the Constitution. It's just bam, it goes right through.
There's one thing I think that changed in that period about the pursuit of the enforcement you were talking about, and we all know a lot of law enforcement was being paid off and probably wasn't very aggressive in pursuing bootleggers. But when they did, there was a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Olmsted, you're thinking of?
No, Carroll v. United States.
Oh, yeah, the searching of the car.
And, because the first thing you learn, I think, if you take a law class is, well, you need a warrant to conduct a search. But what happened? What changed? And how much of that is still with us today as a result of that?
Well, we speak about the rights, criminal due process rights, the criminal rights of the Sixth Amendment rights and Fifth Amendment rights and Fourth Amendment rights. These rights come out of Prohibition. We didn't really have much development of these criminal defense rights because the federal government really did very little criminal prosecutions before Prohibition. Suddenly, there are mass prosecutions, and these bootleggers have a lot of money. They hire attorneys, and they make every objection. So almost all the major frameworks of Fifth Amendment rights and Fourth Amendment rights, search rights, come out of Prohibition. It's really very interesting. And one of the major cases that is a good case today is Carroll. That's a case that Chief Justice Taft writes, saying you don't need a warrant to search a car. Now, there are very complicated rules about that, which I won't go into, but he had to change the way in which the Constitution applied when you needed a warrant. You needed a warrant. You could search something if a felony was being committed in your face, you could see the felony was being committed. But the police didn't know whether carrying liquor was a felony or a misdemeanor because the first two times you did it, it was a misdemeanor.
And you mentioned another case, Olmsted.
Olmsted, that's the wiretapping case. And now that case is a really interesting case because it's well known for one of the great dissents by Brandeis. This is where Brandeis is opposing a prohibition enforcement for wiretapping. And the question is, do you need a warrant to wiretap? And once again, the court comes out for efficient law enforcement. But it's a liberal, Brandeis and Holmes, who dissent on this, saying you should have a warrant to wiretap because that's like a search of a house. And why did a liberal do this? Because the liberals at the time were for greater legislative power. And one of the things prohibition provoked, I showed you what it provoked on the conservative side. On the liberal side, it provoked something really interesting. Liberals like Holmes and Brandeis were saying, well, legislation is a good thing when we want to allow the administrative state to do whatever it's going to do. And Brandeis became aware in a case like Olmsted. In his dissent, he invents what we now call the right to privacy. He's saying the point of the Fourth Amendment is to protect your privacy. That's not what the court had said before that. And by 1960, they begin to adopt the Brandeis dissent, saying the point of requiring a warrant is that you should have privacy in your house from state intrusion. And that was his theory in dissent. Now, why did he do that? He's creating a right against the state, which is not a liberal position until the 1960s. And the answer is what prohibition showed liberals, and there's a lot of writing on this at the time, is that they had assumed that whatever the state did, because it was by a majority, was okay. That was the liberal position. And what Brandeis said is, well, the majority can do things which piss people off so much that the state loses its legitimacy. And if you're a liberal, you want the state to have legitimacy. So we need to limit what the state can do by individual rights, like the rights of Fourth Amendment or privacy, and that will prevent the state, the administrative state, from losing its legitimacy. This is a liberal position that anticipates what happens in the 1960s when liberals became the champions of judicial rights against the administrative state, and conservatives said, let the administrative state do whatever it wants. That the whole positions had become reversed by the 1960s. And prohibition anticipates this reversal.
Two-parter here. Taft is obviously, as we've mentioned, the only person to serve as both president and chief justice. First part, did his experience in the executive branch change the kind of justice he became? And second part to that, how did the Taft court's handling of prohibition, and this is a topic that has been kind of a topic that has been across the first handful of episodes that we have had, fit into the broader expansion of federal administration during this period?
Okay, so the first part of the question, how was being president, how did it affect his ability to be a justice?
Yes.
So I'm going to divide that into two parts. The first is it affected his ability to be a chief justice enormously. So Taft completely reorganized the federal judiciary. He created the Judicial Conference. Before Taft, every judge was in a courtroom and they would do whatever they wanted, and there was no coordination between courts. And prohibition put enormous pressure on federal courts. Some federal courts were swamped, and their delays were 4, 5, 6 years before they could get a case, and others, there were no cases, so they didn't have so much work. There were too many judges for the work. But you couldn't bring the judges to the place where the work was because each judge was a king in their own courtroom, and that was it. As Taft said, they all paddled their own canoe. And so Taft, who had organized the executive branch, brings to the Article 3 branch, to judges, the sense that we're a branch of government that's coordinated. We have to mass our resources where there's a problem to meet the issue wherever it is in the United States. So he conceives the federal judiciary as a whole, conceives of an institutional mechanism, what we now call the Judicial Conference, in order to coordinate where judges would be so that the work of the whole judiciary in the United States would be efficiently met. That meant creating statistics and tracking how many cases there were in each courtroom. He invents all that. This is a total reform. And then he becomes basically the head judge for all of the United States, which the Chief Justice had never been. And then he thinks, well, the Supreme Court is falling behind in its docket. So we need to think of an entirely new way to keep the Supreme Court. And he thinks like an executive. He says, what I need to do is change the docket of the Supreme Court. So before we had all of these mandatory appeals, we had all of these trivial cases, which we had to decide. He passes the Judiciary Act of 1925. And so they say he passes. Well, of course, Congress passes it. But Taft was president. And he knew all the congressmen and senators. So he is spending days and days and days lobbying on Capitol Hill. He is meeting with the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's meeting with the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. He is in Harding's office and Coolidge's office twice or three times a week saying, can you lobby this person? Can you veto this bill? He is a complete lobbyist. And he, as for the first time as a Chief Justice, he completely melds the Supreme Court into the legislative branch and exercises extraordinary influence. He gets legislation passed, the Judiciary Act of 1925, which allows the court to pick its own docket through what's called the writ of certiorari, fundamentally changes the nature of the Supreme Court. So as a Chief Justice, it completely informs what he does, and he completely changes the nature of adjudication in Article 3, both at the Supreme Court level and at the district court level, Taft, because he had been president. Now, as a justice, does it change what he does? And the answer is yes. One of the major themes of the Roberts Code is something called the unitary executive. So the unitary executive means the president has certain prerogative powers that Congress can't intrude on. One of those is the right to fire people. The Supreme Court will decide whether or not President Trump can fire an FTC commissioner or fire a governor of the Federal Reserve Board. So what we've had is now our independent agencies, which the president can't fire. The first opinion in the history of the country in which the court said, Article 2, the president has certain powers that Congress can't intrude on, including the power to fire people at will, is a case called Myers versus United States. And Taft writes that opinion, and he carries the court for that. So the whole unitary executive comes out of Taft, and Taft has this because he was president, and he says the president needs this power or he can't function. So it fundamentally changes the relationship between the president and Congress, and Taft is the one doing that.
Robert Post of the Yale Law School.
Prohibition helped produce major changes in search, surveillance, and the power of the Supreme Court itself.
But the larger lesson was about legitimacy. Even a valid law becomes fragile when much of the country refuses to accept it.
Marijuana now presents that conflict in reverse, as states move away from prohibition while federal restrictions remain.
Robert Michos of Vanderbilt Law School is next.
Real questions, serious debate. This is America at 250. Due Diligence.
America has accomplished so much in these last few years, whether it's been rebuilding our economy or serving the cause of freedom in the world. What we've been able to achieve has been done with your help, with us working together as a nation united. Now, we need your support again. Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
President Ronald Reagan, as the federal government escalated the war on drugs.
Unlike alcohol prohibition, marijuana prohibition was never written into the Constitution. Congress imposed it by statute, but that did not give Washington unlimited power over the states.
States cannot erase federal law, but under the Constitution's anti-commandeering principle, the federal government generally cannot force state legislatures, police, or prosecutors to administer a federal prohibition.
Federal policy has now started to shift. FDA-approved marijuana products and marijuana covered by qualifying state medical licenses have been moved to Schedule 3. What the Drug Enforcement Administration considers substances with low to moderate potential for dependence.
But recreational marijuana, some raw cannabis materials, and synthetically derived THC, the psychoactive that produces the high, remain in Schedule 1, the category for drugs considered unsafe, having no acceptable medical use, and a high potential for abuse.
That leaves an overlapping system. Conduct can be permitted under state law while remaining regulated or prohibited under federal law at the very same time.
Robert A. Michos holds the LaRoche Family Chair in Law at Vanderbilt and is a leading expert on federalism and drug law.
Professor Michos, welcome to America at 250, Due Diligence.
If we could talk a little history here, where the federal government gets involved in wholesale banning of things that people like. And we're going to be talking about marijuana, which I see the industry now prefers we use the term cannabis. And then in the past, more than 100 years ago, it was alcohol. Let's go back to that time. How did the federal government get away with this sort of wholesale ban of alcohol for so many years?
That really was an unusual case because Prohibition emerged at a time when the United States Supreme Court was still limiting Congress's substantive powers. The court had issued rulings on the commerce power, for example. That's the power to regulate commerce among the several states. The court had issued rulings in the first part of the 20th century that severely constrained Congress's use of that power. So it actually took a constitutional amendment to enable the federal government to get involved and to endorse prohibition. It's important to recognize that the states were already doing this. This was really kind of a ground-up movement where it started in the states and then eventually reached a crescendo where the federal government got involved. But at that time, when this was done, it took a constitutional amendment to enable Congress to do that.
And then there was another constitutional amendment, correct?
Yeah, so then we have the repeal of federal prohibition. That was necessary because you couldn't just by statute kind of remove this federal prohibition from the book. So it took a constitutional amendment to do that. The 21st Amendment, of course, repeals the amendment giving Congress this power and passing a federal prohibition. The interesting thing there is that even though the federal government decided or the nation decided we don't want a national prohibition on alcoholic beverages, there were still several states that were happy to retain their prohibitions after the federal prohibition was taken off the books. There were a lot of states that immediately repealed their own, that said we're going to open up the distribution of alcohol, kind of take it slow at first. But it wasn't for another couple of decades until the last state finally repealed its own statewide prohibition. I think that was actually Mississippi.
Yes.
That was the last to do that. And even today, in some states, they allow local governments like counties to ban distribution of alcohol. So it's an interesting scenario.
We're going to talk about the 10th Amendment in a minute, but there were a couple of other amendments that were involved in this whole prohibition and repeal drama in early 20th century history. Which amendments were they, Robert?
Yeah, the 18th Amendment is the one that specifically authorized Congress, the national government, to prohibit the sale of alcohol. So that had to be done via a constitutional amendment at the time, because under the Supreme Court's jurisprudence then, Congress lacked the power to regulate alcohol sales under, say, the Commerce Clause. Then we needed the 21st Amendment to undo the 18th, to repeal the 18th Amendment, and to take the federal government out of prohibition and kind of return that issue by and large to the states.
Where does the 10th Amendment get involved with all of this when we're talking about the issues with cannabis now?
Yeah, the 10th Amendment, it plays a really important role today. It explains ultimately why the states have been able to get away with legalizing something the federal government forbids. The 10th Amendment on its face doesn't seem to do much. It's simply a reminder textually that Congress's powers are limited to those that have been granted in other parts of the Constitution. Like Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce among the states. It's pretty much just a reminder of that. And the Supreme Court in the past said that those substantive powers were quite limited. But starting with the New Deal and really to the present day, the Supreme Court hasn't imposed many limitations on what Congress is allowed to regulate through all its substantive powers. In fact, there was a famous case decided in 2005, Gonzalez versus Reshape, where the Supreme Court basically affirmed the federal ban on marijuana as applied to a couple of seriously ill women who claimed that they were growing their own marijuana or getting it as a gift from some friends. There was no buying and selling taking place. All of their activities supposedly were taking place within the confines of California. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court said, well, Congress's power to regulate commerce among the states extends to their activities. Congress can go ahead and prohibit them from growing marijuana, from even transferring it, even non-commercially. So that's not, there's no real limit to the scope of Congress's substantive powers today. But there's a second limit, a less well-known one that's associated with the 10th Amendment, and that's something we call the anti-commandeering rule. The anti-commandeering rule, in a nutshell, it says that Congress can't force the states to enact a law or to help enforce a federal statute.
It certainly seems that on the federal level, we're headed towards this being legalized eventually. I don't think we're there yet. I know the president and the administration has made some moves, some orders in recent months. But what, on a national level, what would a serious national settlement on marijuana actually need to include? And what are your thoughts on? Do you agree that we're likely looking at legalization sometime down the road, maybe not immediately, but sometime in the near future, in the next 5-10 years?
I think it's inevitable. I hesitate to give a kind of time prediction, because I've thought this would be inevitable for a long time now, more than 5 or 10 years. Such a large part of the American public supports federal legalization at this point. It's something like 2/3 of every American on the street would say, yeah, we should legalize marijuana, not just for medical purposes, but for all adults. So I think the writing's on the wall. It eventually will happen. What would need to happen is you would need to get some formal acknowledgement from the federal government, some law that actually says the possession, distribution, manufacture of marijuana and marijuana products is legal under federal law. That's really what's necessary to kind of move the needle from where we are today. It's been a long time since the federal government was actually arresting anyone for marijuana offenses, at least when those offenses were not offenses under state law. The Clinton administration tried, when California was kind of the first state in the nation to legalize medical marijuana. The Clinton administration tried to put a lid on it. The George W. Bush administration tried to put a lid on it. It failed because they didn't have the resources. There were too many people, too many states doing this. So eventually, under the Obama administration, the DOJ kind of recognized, hey, we're just going to give up. We're waving a white flag. If you're obeying state law, we're not going to touch you. And that had some benefit, I would say. Companies could rest assured that they weren't going to go to federal prison for growing and selling marijuana.
In that context, how does what's going on with marijuana and potential legalization at the national level compare in your mind to what happened during Prohibition, where in some areas, like in my area where I am in north central Illinois, bars didn't shut down. There was basically no difference from before Prohibition and Prohibition. And that whole fight around legalization of marijuana versus looking back to Prohibition and making alcohol legal again at a national level. Is there any comparison?
Yeah, the two scenarios are similar in that both of these substances are wildly popular. So alcohol, there are millions of people during Prohibition that wanted to and were able to drink alcohol. Same, even under marijuana Prohibition, there were millions of people that were using that drug. It's not that difficult to manufacture either of these. People can grow their own marijuana. People were able to distill their own alcohol. So as a practical matter, that just makes it very difficult for any government to put a stop to this, to put a stop to an activity that is so popular, so ubiquitous, and is so easy to engage in. So it's almost like Prohibition is futile in a sense. But today, and possibly also with alcohol prohibition may not be 100% effective, but it still creates lots of headaches for the people that are involved in the industry. For example, today with marijuana, it's legal under state law. It's illegal under federal law. The DOJ isn't going to arrest you, but you still can't get a bank account, for example. Because the bank says, well, all the proceeds of your activities, that's all tainted money. We can't handle cash from the sale of marijuana. In like measure, 100 years ago during Prohibition, you did have lots of people who were running alcohol, but they were illegal operators. They were skirting Prohibition, but they were probably also playing fast and loose with tax laws and so on. So that's the troubling thing today, is that we have a state licensed marijuana industry. It is operating in the open, in contrast maybe with some of those Prohibition era suppliers.
Yeah.
But they still can't function like a normal law-abiding business because they can't get bank accounts, because they can't get trademarks on their products. They're not supposed to be listed on the stock exchanges. So you worry about the health of that industry. You kind of invite people to step in and compete in the illicit market as well, because there's less of an advantage to operating above board and complying with all the laws. So there are some similarities there between the two scenarios.
Final question. You have to jump through a lot of hoops in some of these states to get the medical marijuana card. You talk with a doctor on the phone who will give you, I think in 99.9% of the cases, authorizes the prescription. Is the medical marijuana business, the dispensaries, just sort of a way station on the road to recreational marijuana in most states?
I think for the vast majority of users, that's the case, that they might sign up for a medical marijuana card. They might go to their physician to seek the physician's blessing, their recommendation, when the state only has a medical marijuana law, because that's the only legal way to obtain it and to possess it. But we've seen in a lot of states that have later added an adult use marijuana law, where they've said it's legal for anyone over the age, of 21 years or older to possess marijuana, that the number of people participating in those medical marijuana programs, the number of people bothering to go to the doctor to get the recommendation and so on, plummets. It just falls through the floor. That suggests to me that a lot of people who are using this, even in a medical marijuana program where that's the only game in town, they're not necessarily using it for kind of traditional medical purposes.
Robert Michos of Vanderbilt Law School.
A trio of guests with several distinct views on how prohibition takes hold and how it comes apart.
Richard Hamm showed how organized movements can build enough political power to turn a moral cause into a national law.
Robert Post outlined how enforcing that law can shape constitutional doctrine and test the legitimacy of the courts.
And Robert Michos showed how states can resist a federal policy without repealing it, changing the reality on the ground while the national rule remains in place.
Alcohol prohibition required 2 constitutional amendments. Marijuana prohibition came through federal law and has weakened state by state.
The founders divided power between the nation and the states. The prohibition debate shows why that division still matters. Who makes the rule? Who must enforce it? And what happens when the country stops believing in it?
This has been America at 250, Due Diligence. I'm Steve Herman.
And I'm Bill Bernardoni. We want to thank our guests, Professor Richard Hamm, Professor Robert Post, and Professor Robert Michos.
Send us your comments online at radiofreeamerica.media. That's radiofreeamerica.media. Executive producers of America at 250 Due Diligence are Steve Herman and Bill Bernardoni. Audio production by Bill Bernardoni of Bernardoni Media and Marketing. Support for the program comes from the Radio Free America Project and the Jordan Center for Journalism Advocacy and Innovation at the University of Mississippi School of Journalism and New Media. For more information, please visit newslab.org. Again, that's newslab.org.
Portions of this program are recorded at WUMS Radio in Oxford, Mississippi. For Steve Herman, I'm Bill Bernardoni. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next time as we continue discussing the ideas and principles that shape America at 250.